Thank you very much. I very much appreciate the Society's invitation to speak tonight, and I'm very glad to be back in Newcastle, as always. I was asked specifically to talk about Ralph Tailor's Summer, and it seemed to me that that presents an opportunity not to give you a précis of the book, but rather to reflect a bit on the process of researching and writing this kind of history. I won't assume at all that people have read the book. You may have had no occasion to do so. That those of you who have will be reminded of one or two highlights of it. Otherwise, I hope that those of you who haven't might be interested enough to pick it up. Some kinds of history are very purposefully planned. Others begin by accident. The planned interventions tend to be novel contributions to an existing debate, new perspectives on an established problem. The accidental ones somehow step outside the normal historical agenda. They involve diversions from the recommended route. They lead you to unexpected places. They address issues that are not so much talked about. They always carry a risk of getting lost, but they can also prove interesting. Well, I came upon Ralph Tailor, or Ralph Tailor as his name was pronounced at the time, by accident. As I explained in the prologue to the book, I was browsing through church court records, deposition books, fragmentary deposition books for the year 1637, looking for illustrative material for a project I was working on at that time, when I suddenly encountered this strikingly elaborate signature at the foot of one of the depositions. And it was the extraordinary nature of the signature which led me to stop and read the deposition. And it told me that Ralph Tailor was from Newcastle, that he was 26 years old, and that on the 8th of August 1636, having been sent for, he climbed up onto the town wall of Newcastle, adjoining to the quay near the river, and heard and did commit to writing the last will of Thomas Holmes, which was spoken to him by Holmes from an attic window near the wall. And Holmes was confined in that attic because he was dying of the plague. I was intrigued by that vivid story, and so I checked the index of wills to see whether Holmes's will survived, and found that it did indeed. That's not Ralph Tailor on the wall of Newcastle. In fact, it's two Dutchmen, but never mind. This is Thomas Holmes's will, written on the city wall in August 1636. After I'd read the will and took some notes on it, I moved on. I thought I'd find a way to use this vivid material one day. But in the following folio of the deposition book, I came upon Tailor again, and again, and then again. I learned that he was a scrivener by profession, a professional writer, which explains the beautiful signature. I found that his name was pronounced Ralph, because that's how it was written, phonetically, when other people referred to him. And all of his depositions related to incidents in an outbreak of the plague in Newcastle in 1636. And furthermore, I was learning as I went on that there was a good deal more material of a similar kind. I realized by the end of the afternoon that there might be a story to be told here. Maybe a study of the plague from below, a closer encounter with the experience of the plague. Maybe an essay in a style of history that I've always found satisfying, that is, microhistory. Now, microhistory is not a school of history, it's not a theory of history, it's more just a style of history, a particular way of framing a space in which to pursue knowledge and understanding of the past. It involves, as the name implies, first of all, a reduction of scale, focusing on a particular individual, a single place, a particular moment in time, an event. It involves an intensity of focus, which permits patient attention to small details in the evidence, and the intricate linkage of records where possible. But at the same time, microhistory also harbors a larger set of ambitions. There's the possibility, by looking very closely, of seeing things previously unobserved, hidden complexities, a more vivid sense, perhaps, of the lived experience of the past and its diversity, perhaps new interpretative meanings. The Italian microhistorians who coined the name of this approach to history, an approach which had long existed, but they branded it, as it were, they were perhaps the most conceptually ambitious about the possibilities of this kind of work, of this way of approaching the past. They were deeply concerned with what the late Philip Abrams of Durham University called the problematic of structuring. That's to say, the relationship between individual human agency and social and cultural structures. Carlo Ginzburg and Carlo Poni argued that the aim of microhistory was to uncover what they called the invisible structures within which the lived experience of the individual is articulated. Or Giovanni Levi, another founder of this approach, argued that it was fundamentally an inquiry into the extent and nature of free will within the general structures of human society. Ambitious indeed. Other microhistorians in the Anglo-American tradition have been content to claim only that they're telling significant and meaningful stories about the past, giving a human face to some of the larger abstractions of historical change. But whatever the case, it comes to pretty much the same thing. The larger meanings, interpretatively, emerge from the specific case. The structures of society and culture are encountered. The stories become significant when they are placed and understood in context. To quote Carlo Ginzburg again, what all these investigations have in common is the insistence on context. The explanatory process proceeds through the provision or the recreation of contexts. As Edward Thompson famously argued, the discipline of history is the discipline of context. One fact acquires meaning within the context of other meanings. That's how small things acquire larger implications. Well, Ralph Tailor's Summer was consciously researched and written in that kind of microhistorical tradition. It's about a particular moment in the history of a town and in the life of a man. It's about recovering an event which was drastic at the time, but which rapidly became eclipsed, ascribed no particular meaning in the place where it occurred. It's about the experience of the plague, about an urban society under terrible stress, and what that experience and the documents that it generated reveal about the social and institutional and ideological structures of that time and that place, about the attitudes and the values of the people of the time, about their physical environment and their material culture, their solidarities and their conflicts. It's also about one man's upward social mobility in a town that was already a commercial and industrial hub of growing importance. It's about a Geordie on the make. And it's about historical documents, how they were made, who made them, and what we can make of them. But if it became all of these things, it didn't start that way. And that raises another general characteristic about microhistory as an approach. Microhistories almost always start by accident. People notice something in the archives. They realize, either straight away or more likely later on, that it has potential. And when I say that they realize its potential, I don't mean that they grasp immediately what can be done with it, like some kind of flash of poetic inspiration. Not at all. If that ever happens, it's pretty rare. Rather, I mean that they intuit the latent possibilities of some fragment of the past that just intrigues them, but about which they have no preconceived expectations, no preconceived argument, just a sense that somehow this matters, that it's worth stopping and exploring it. I think to this important extent, doing microhistory is usually a process of exploration. It's undertaken not so much to illustrate things already known, as to explore things that are otherwise inaccessible. You start with spotting something that appeals. It appeals to some existing preoccupation of which you're scarcely aware. But after that, you're engaged in a process of discovery, finding things out, putting things together, searching, joining them up, as one question triggers another. It's akin to the advice which the jazz musician Miles Davis famously used to give to the younger members of his band. First play what you know, then play above that. Or as he said, first play what you know, then play above that. Famous for his rasping voice. Anyway, it's advice which applies equally well to historical research. And this project was like that. It began, as I've described to you, by chance. But then it proceeded in stages, as chance gave way to purposeful research. So the first stage, which we can label the stage of just reconnaissance, looking at the possibilities, a preliminary survey of what might be doable. How much was already known about the Newcastle plague of 1636, about which I knew nothing? The answer was not a lot. It gets occasional mentions in the secondary literature, most of them based upon a pamphlet written by the Puritan minister Robert Jennison in 1637, Newcastle's Call, a plea for repentance in a sinful city which had been justly afflicted by the hand of God. Jennison included weekly mortality figures for the town in an appendix, and these also have been quoted in the literature. I only later learned that similar figures had been compiled by William Colson of Jesmond, who entered them in his family Bible. They both had access to bills of mortality collected by the town's authorities. Okay, could the progress of the epidemic through the city be traced through these mortality figures provided by Jennison and what survived in the parish register burial entries? Yes, it could, albeit imperfectly, since the parish registers of St. John's and St. Andrews have gaps, and the parish registers for the largest and most populous parish of All Hallows, or All Saints as it now is, were missing for 1636. So it was possible to produce a table with, on the left, the figures from Jenison and Colson, then the figures for the other parishes where available, and to calculate what was missing from the parochial registration, which enabled me to figure out how many deaths were probably occurring in All Hallows. So one could put together an account of the plague in that kind of statistical form. Another question, how much material survived amongst the depositions relating to post-plague probate litigation and amongst the surviving wills and inventories for estates which were probated from 1636 through to 1638 in the aftermath of the plague? The answer, a great deal. Death always generates records. Epidemic mortality generates them in exceptional numbers. The plague of 1636 caused a threefold increase in surviving probate documents. There were more wills, there were more inventories relating to many more people than in a normal year. And whereas the full court records of the Durham Consistory Court for 1690 to 20 and for 1627 to 30 suggested that they usually turned up about 2 cases relating to the probate of wills in normal years, the court books for 1637, even though they were seriously incomplete, provide evidence of 22 such causes. So an 11-fold increase in probate litigation as compared to a normal year. So I went through those records carefully, initially noting down only material directly related to the plague, just noting its survival. But that alone provided enough to encourage me. This material was not only fairly abundant for the years immediately after the plague, but it was rich in quality. It's full of unanticipated incidents. The dying men who carefully provided for unborn children. If the child that my wife is with comes forward, I give it £20. Whereas my wife is now with a child, if it please God she be safely delivered, it should have its proportionate part. And for the child that it is hoped my wife is with, I give it, and so on. The tailor, Thomas Clark, leaving a suit of clothes and 20 shillings to his servant, Edward Fletcher, in lieu of his mother's love in entertaining my daughter Margaret. The inventory accompanying the will reveals that the child had been sent for safety to Edward's mother in Rothbury. The town minstrel, George Wrightson, also described in the records as George the Fiddler, who distributed his collection of instruments to his musical friends on his deathbed. His best treble viol to William Rowe, one recorder and a flute to Robert Brown, and left the rest of his small estate to Jane Brown, probably Robert's sister, my elected wife, adding, if it was 6 times as much, and my blessing. The elaborate statement of faith of one John Heslop of Pudding Chair, who filled up 20 of the 52 lines of his will with this statement, describing himself as being at this present visited by God's holy hand with the infection of pestilence, the rod and scourge of his wrath against offenders for their great and grievous sins against his majesty. I, being one of the greatest, am not certain to remain here in this earthly tabernacle the least moment, especially now, in these sad and lamentable times. There was Jane Glazenby's penned will sent to her brother-in-law in writing will and endorsed on the outside, "Brother George, I pray you, lay this safely up, and be careful that it be not broken up till you hear further of me again." Margaret Hindness, a poor woman, clambering with the help of a blacksmith through the barred-up window of John Stobbs's quarantine house in order to be his nurse or keeper, and finding him, she tells us, sat upon the chamber floor, not able to get to his bed without her help. The inventory details in many inventories are provision for the sick, the costs of burials carefully noted as charges against particular estates. The vivid accounts of the making of wills declared by quarantined testators who were sparred up, as it was described, speaking through doors or barred windows to groups of people gathered outside as nigh as they durst adventure. Who was there? What was said? Elizabeth Cook's desire, expressed in her will, to be buried in the churchyard of St. Nicholas's parish, near unto the hawthorn tree there. That's a mysterious request which still haunts me. What could it have meant to her? Many, many voices. Freemen of the town, poor hirelings, men and women, old and young, telling stories pushed up from inside the experience of the plague. And almost too much to hope for, there was also the frequent presence in the evidence of Ralph Tailor, 25 at the time, a scrivener, sent to write around a quarter of the surviving wills, and who gave evidence in probate causes far more than any other individual. Ralph Tailor's florid signature at the bottom of will after will. Ralph Tailor on the town wall, listening to Thomas Holmes. Ralph Tailor finding the weaver, Thomas Finley, standing at his door and recruiting him to be the witness to a will. Ralph Tailor entering the house of Robert Moore, who then lay sick of the plague, while Robert's son very prudently remained outside. And then hearing Robert dictate his will through a wooden partition, well knowing his voice and tongue, although he did not then see him, he tells us. This is Robert Moore's will, written in the room next door to where the dying man was lying. We have Ralph Tailor again, making inventories once plague houses had been cleansed, and proceeding methodically through, room by room, lot by lot. We have Ralph Tailor turning up in Plummer's Chair in All Hallows Parish, his principal sphere of operations, but sometimes up the hill in St. Nicholas's Parish, or in St. John's. You could imagine him panting his way up the long stairs. Ralph Tailor in Durham, giving evidence confidently to the consistory court in the Galilee Chapel, describing himself as living a scrivener in the same town, and familiar with divers businesses of the clients he had served. And then Ralph Tailor and his new wife in March 1637, when it was all over, amongst those listed as buying household goods at the estate sale of the plague victim Thomas Eden, a man whose inventory Ralph had actually prepared 2 months earlier, doubtless taking note of interesting items that were coming out of the sale. Together they spent close to £3. They bought a standing bed, a feather bed, a chest, a great deal of linen, a chair and a large serving dish. They were setting up home. When I read that, I sat back in the record office and thought, you couldn't make it up. By the end of the survey, I knew I had something worth doing, and that Ralph Tailor's recorded activities provided a kind of thread on which one could string the beads of evidence. And I realized also that there was simply too much material on every aspect of the epidemic to cram into an 8,000-word article. So I needed to consider whether it could be expanded into a short book. That realization initiated the second stage of research, which I could describe as the thickening in the culinary sense of the word. Could the mortality figures be combined with the probate and litigation evidence to trace the course of the epidemic through the town more fully? Yes, it could in some degree. It seems to have begun combining all the evidence in All Hallows parish, moved to St. Nicholas, then to St. John's, then to St. Andrews, engulfing the whole town by August and September 1636, and then very gradually subsiding in October and November. Could the parish register analysis be extended beyond the head counting of the dead to analysing the mortality more closely? Yes, it could, with the use of simple name indexes and a kind of limited reconstitution of the families or the households in which the deaths occurred. That revealed the concentrated demographic impact of the disease. For example, in St. John's, where the register is particularly good, and the parish clerk explicitly attributed the burials of individuals to the households of individual householders, a great deal can be done. That revealed that 2/3 of the male-headed households suffered at least one death. So 2/3 of those households suffer at least one death. But the impact of plague, although it was widespread, was also highly concentrated, because 1/4 of the households suffered more than one fatality, some of them as many as 5. And it was these hardest hit families which accounted for more than half the burials in the entire parish. Could all this be contextualized within a reconstruction of the social structure and social topography of the town? Yes, it could, with the aid of analysis of the hearth tax returns for 1665, which reveal the population density and the relative wealth and poverty of the different wards of the town. That can be combined also with the occupational data in the parish registers and with early topographical descriptions of Newcastle to get a closer sense of the place. There you have the number of households in each ward. The shaded areas represent the poorest wards, and the striped areas the richest, in terms of the proportion of householders who were or were not exempt from taxation in 1665. And that sense of the social topography is very much borne out by the other evidence of occupations and contemporary descriptions by William Gray, by William Ralph, and later by Henry Bourne. What survived in the city archives or in correspondence between Newcastle's magistrates and the Privy Council, which might illuminate the response of the authorities to the crisis? Not a lot, because of the loss of many of the corporation records, but it could prove quite valuable insofar as it survived. There was evidence, for example, in the Chamberlain's accounts of the money raised by the magistrates and spent upon the relief of the afflicted, on the loans they raised to get that money, on the fact that the coal trade actually continued throughout the epidemic, albeit at a much lower level at the peak of the plague. Evidence also of the flight of what they described as the best sort of citizen, who had houses elsewhere that they could retreat to as places of safety. And the probate and the litigation evidence also provided details of another policy of the magistrates the sparring up or shutting up of infected households, and the erection by the magistrates of what they called lodges for some of the sick on the town moors. The impassioned accounts of the plague as a judgment of God, which were penned by the town's Puritan lecturer, Robert Jennison, and were added to later by one of his flock, John Fenwick, give a vivid sense of how these men understood the plague as a judgment upon the town's luxuriant sinfulness. They vividly convey the meaning of it all to some of Newcastle's embattled Puritan minority. Marvellous rhetoric. "O Newcastle, when wilt thou learn the dialect of heaven? O Newcastle, Newcastle, wilt thou not be made clean? When shall it be?" Not yet. But could all this be placed in the context of the larger religious conflicts of the period, both within Newcastle and indeed in the kingdom as a whole? Yes, it could. Back to the 1620s with the aid of the sermons of Jennison and the evidence relating to religious conflict between him and the so-called Arminian minister of the city. This theme could also be pursued most unexpectedly in the personal testimonies of some of Jennison's Puritan flock, who migrated to New England after 1636 and were subsequently received there and had their confessions of faith recorded in note form by Thomas Shepherd, the minister of Cambridge, Massachusetts, who had himself lived in Heaven on the Wall in 1632 to 34 and preached in and about Newcastle. They went to him and sometimes told him their stories. What could I find out about Ralph Tailor and his career? That meant following the clues in his own will of 1669, back to St. Margaret's, Durham, where he had been born and baptized in 1611, and then through the wills of the many Tailors of Durham and Newcastle, trying to make connections between these families, and subsequently trawling the records of Newcastle's guilds for traces of his activities after 1637 and his eventual ascent to a position of considerable respect and relative wealth as one of the town's leading notaries public. But more specifically, it also meant tracking his recorded activities during the plague itself, which had been the first year of his independent professional life. He had just completed his apprenticeship. Noting down, when did he appear? Where did he appear? Who did he encounter? List all these things chronologically. Reconstruct as far as possible his networks of association. He's known, for example, to have encountered at least 81 people, that's recorded, in the course of the plague. And he was connected, either directly or through one intermediary, to more than half the people for whom plague wills and inventories survive. That sort of thing reveals the tendrils of connective tissue generated by family, neighborhood, trade, business, guild membership, and so forth, that gave the society of 17th century Newcastle its cohesion and its resilience in the face of the crisis. Ralph Tailor, as he pursued his work, was becoming ever more deeply embedded in that world, and his role in sustaining it during the crisis of 1636 was arguably the making of him. Could the bequests that he and men like him recorded be analysed more systematically, in a way that would throw light on the various mutualities and obligations of family, friendship, and neighbourhood? Yes, it could. though it meant going back over all the surviving wills for the years from 1634-5 through to 1638, more rigorously, more systematically, looking as carefully as possible at the patterns of bequests, of who the beneficiaries were, the recipients of tokens of regard which were left to them by dying individuals, who were the executors, who were the witnesses, and the many forms of evidence of attachment and request for burials in particular places that the evidence provides. I was trying to look at what these laconic documents, which are, on the one hand, they're generic in form, but on the other hand, they're unique to the individuals for whom they're being made. What can it tell us about their relationships? What can it reveal about their emotional lives, their concerns, their anxieties, their attachments to people and to places? Could the inventories, which often proceed like this one, room by room, the inventories that are drawn up by Ralph Tailor and others, could they be used to explore the material culture of Newcastle's freemen at this time? And also to gauge the financial impact on their households of the costs of sickness and death? Yes, they could. First, with more systematic attention to what the inventories reveal about housing types, about the types of goods people possessed and their location. And then one could use the inventories, or at least many of them, to calculate the impact upon the gross value of a person's estate of the charges which were being deducted for their maintenance and nursing while they were quarantined, for their funeral expenses, or the debts which were owed to them, which had been rendered desperate, i.e. uncollectible, by plague mortality, or by the impoverishment of the people who owed them money. It turned out that in almost a third of the cases which could be closely examined in this way, the estate which was left to the survivors of the plague was very seriously impaired. That's to say, the net value was less than half of the gross value. And in a further 1/5 of cases, the outcome was absolutely disastrous for the families concerned. That's to say, the net value of the estate was negative. Could the litigation in which Ralph and others gave evidence be used to assess the impact of the plague on social relations? Again, yes, it could, by examining the identities of those who litigated, the issues that were revealed in causes, the witnesses to the events that were recorded, all pieced together in the broader context of litigation over such issues back to the 1610s. There was conflict, there was challenge to the validity of wills made under exceptional circumstances, there were objections raised and resentments expressed. But there was also many more positive stories of the plague and witnesses' accounts of their participation in specific events. The people who hurried through the streets to fetch a scrivener like Ralph Tailor, the witnesses who gathered outside doors or beneath windows, those who visited the sick, kinsfolk, friends, fellow guild members, above all, neighbours, the many people who described their participation by simply saying being a neighbour, a near neighbour, a neighbour and gossip, a friend and neighbour. No other explanation for their presence and their actions was deemed necessary. And finally, could all of this be located physically within the town? Could the physical environment and context be reconstructed more closely? It could, to a degree, with the aid of early maps, chorographical descriptions, travellers' accounts of Newcastle at the time, or close to the time, the references to specific locations which are mentioned in the evidence provided by the probate records or the court cases, and even Victorian photographs of long vanished streets and alleys. There's another inventory. Castle Garth, Dog Bank beneath All Hallows. And I did a good deal of walking around the old town on quiet spring mornings with a couple of Xeroxes of maps in my pocket, 1655, 1736. I loved that, noting the gradients. Towards the end of chapter 4, there's a reference to how in the city silenced by the plague, one would hear the cry of the gulls on the river. I noticed that one spring morning, standing on Percy Street. I noticed that when there was no traffic, you could hear the gulls on the river. Okay, by this time, as will be evident, regular 2-week research trips were alternating with periods back home, analysing the material gathered on particular issues. The analysis suggested further questions. The questions prompted the final stages of research, which I don't know what to call it, tweaking. What do scriveners do? You can find out by reading contemporary guides to writing and to the making of legal instruments. What more does one need to know about 17th century probate law? It's all in Henry Swinburne's wonderful brief treatise of testaments and last wills, published in 1611, which is actually not so brief, in fact. And of course, there was a large international literature on plague to read, check out, and it prompted further ideas. So after the initial stage of research and analysis, we proceeded together, one informing the other, finding things out, consolidate, put it together, find out more things, establish what was doable, and let that suggest further possibilities. The dialogue with the editors, which we all know. And inevitably, that continued during the writing. I suppose one is never quite ready to write, at least I'm not. But you reach a point at which you know you have to start that miserable process. And in this instance, that was when I felt I had enough, a sufficiently developed sense of the whole picture to begin putting it together. I had a file full of analyses of particular issues, sort of set pieces on particular issues, which could be expanded, tables, lists, timelines of events. And I also had a very large collection by now of little vignettes from the experience of the plague, moments of the plague, fragments of what people told about it, striking words and phrases they used to describe their experience. Putting that together was obviously a different job, a kind of mosaic work, assemble the little tiles and into patterns, push them into the plaster in a way that would catch the light. And I had a broad theme, that however ghastly the experience of the plague, it was less destructive of social bonds than is often believed. That ultimately this would be a story about human resilience, about ordinary people's capacity to hold firm and contain the disintegrating forces that had been unleashed amongst them. And I had the microhistorian's comforting knowledge that I was working with a finite body of material, basically 2 files, one containing notes on the sources, the other analysis, lists, tables, and so forth. I could go back over it all in a matter of hours, if need arose. So start. Right, I won't try to describe the details of the writing process, but I can highlight 2 basic objectives that informed it. First, I knew you had to keep it fairly short and tight. Microhistorians seem to me to work best if they're not too long. They make their points more effectively and hold the reader's attention if you keep the length down. Secondly, the story of an event shaped in part by one man's remarkably large role in recording that event, obviously needed to take a narrative form. But there were two narratives going on. There was the story of the plague itself, and there was what I could find out about Ralph Tailor's story. So there needed to be a way of braiding and interweaving the two narratives to best effect. The stages of the epidemic and its aftermath would provide the basic narrative. But within that, I had to try to introduce Ralph Tailor's story bit by bit and keep him alive in the reader's mind as the account of the plague unfolded. So basically what that meant in practice is one had to keep mentioning him, to repeatedly bring him into the story when the opportunity arose, detail his activities in 1636, of course, pause occasionally to focus on his background, his training, his role, his subsequent career, use him as the point of entry into the larger issues. For example, approach the inventory analysis of material culture via his experience in making inventories and what he must have learned in that process about goods, about their value, about the commercial life of the town. Or again, approach the litigation via his role and voice as a witness. Use his recoverable social networks to reveal the tightly interconnected world of the freeman. Thirdly, I knew that the narrative of the plague in Newcastle and of responses to it would need explanatory contextualization at many points. So it would be necessary to alternate narrative and analysis and contextualization without losing the momentum of the event as a whole and Taylor's place in it. And it was Carlo Ginzburg's classic microhistory, The Trees and the Worms, the outstanding example of Italian microhistory, which suggested how best to do that kind of job. So following his example, I originally wrote the book as a series of very short sections, simply numbered in rough sequence. And I came to think of them as units of sense. That's a phrase I borrowed from a discussion I read about the structure of narrative poetry. Little units of the story which just felt right as steps in the gradual unfolding of an analytical narrative, helping to make sense of it all. At the same time, this succession of small steps seemed to me the best way to involve the reader in the process of reconstructing what was happening through the documentation. Once that was done, I later grouped some of these little units of sense together in order to give the final chapters a greater symmetry. But it remains a book of 12 very short chapters, plus a prologue and an epilogue. The chapters average only 11 and a half pages in length, and that was deliberate. So the book emerged in small units. But unless that sounds too painless, I should perhaps mention, as I come towards the end, two dirty little secrets about the writing. First of all, misled and seduced by historians interested in more adventurous forms of historical writing, I experimented with ventriloquizing Ralph Tailor. I created brief imagined dialogues between him and other people he encountered as he moved about the town, all based on the evidence of meetings that had occurred, but imaginary, and written in a phonetically spelt Geordie accent. All of this in italics. It was fun. I also tried holding back to the very end the revelation that Ralph Tailor had got married immediately after the plague, in the hope of providing a kind of Hollywood happy ending. So those are the dirty little secrets, but in both cases, wise and honest friends firmly intervened and restrained me, for which I'm very grateful. One final point. As with previous efforts to write history of this kind, I found myself at the end being left with paradoxical emotions. On the one hand, satisfaction, sometimes even a kind of joy, at what it is possible to recover from historical documents, if you read them closely. But on the other hand, a sense of resignation and a sort of enhanced sense of the limits of what one can ever know about the past. Of course, things continue to turn up, and they have turned up since publication. I now know, because of someone who got in touch with me, that there's a third set of weekly bills of mortality figures surviving for Newcastle in 1636, and it confirms one of the book's suggestions that burial pits were being dug at Garth Heads to the north of the Sandgate. A student from Columbia University found and brought to my attention a moralizing poem on the Great Plague Tyne in Newcastle, which had been written in 1637. I could have used that. My attention was drawn to the evidence of the scars left by the plague of 1636 on one of Newcastle's merchant families. I found myself that a certain Thomas Tailor was the curate of Washington, County Durham, in 1624, and that his signature bore some resemblance to that of Ralph Tailor. This man was then aged 35 and was too young to have been Ralph Tailor's father, but he may have been a relative who had also been educated, in this case for the clergy, and perhaps had attended the same writing school. I now also know more about Ralph Tailor Sr., the wealthy tanner of Crossgate and Durham, who I speculated in the book might have been Ralph Tailor's godfather and possible sponsor. A Durham Palatinate case reveals him doing business in Newcastle at St. Luke's Fair and connects him directly with John Taylor of All Hallows Parish, a butcher, who certainly was connected also and was probably a kinsman of the young Ralph. And so on could go on. There's yet another superb example of Ralph Tailor's signature, pointed out to me by Stephen Healy of Trinity House. It's attesting the ownership of Trinity House of a 1631 edition of John Fox's Book of Martyrs. Ralph Tailor by this time was a member of Trinity House and clearly doing work in the library. Nevertheless, I recognized that I was able to tell only part of the story of Newcastle's Great Plague of 1636. Other aspects of what happened can be glimpsed, but remain out of reach. Notably, the experience of the poor who left no wills, those whose deaths were registered as unidentified people, who had no roots in the town, who were imperfectly known, who did not yet belong to any neighbourhood, those registered as, for example, a poor child, two poor ones, and so forth. And one can never really know Ralph Tailor. There's probably more that can be found out about him. A man of his eventual standing must have left a further paper trail scattered here and there. But it doesn't really matter. This project wasn't a biography. It was a microhistory. What matters for this purpose is what he did in 1636 and what the kinds of records he created and the events that he helped to record reveal about the society and culture of the town in which he lived. It was Ralph's recurrent presence in the records that, of course, first alerted me to the possibility of exploring the events he helped to record. It was that presence which gave me the feeling almost that he was tugging at my sleeve. I'm glad he did.
We have time for one or two questions. Now the way this works is that there are people with microphones who will come to you if you have something to say. And I know that Paul Whitwell has agreed to ask the first question and open our discussion. Paul's just there.
Thank you very much for a fascinating account of how you approached this and cast so much light on what I think all the victims said were sad and lamentable times that the people of Newcastle were experiencing. The question really that came to my mind was, a layman, is obviously plague. People think of the Great Plague of London some 30 years later. When this outbreak occurred here in our town, was it regarded as something very much in isolation, or was it something that was known, talked about right through the country, and did people, in a sense, benefit from the experience in terms of working out ways of coping better with outbreaks of plague? Obviously the grief and the misery, still there's nothing that can be done, but practical items that you touched on, like the legal difficulties, financial difficulties, very practical things like sanitation and disposal of the dead. I mean, was that in people's minds in later outbreaks?
The basic policies that magistrates followed had been laid down as early as 1578 with the issue by the Privy Council under Elizabeth of plague orders which were to be followed. That included controversial policies like quarantining houses, which some contemporaries thought made the mortality worse, since you were quarantining both the sick and the healthy in a shut-up house. But it was stuck with. Those policies were followed right through to the 1665 London outbreak, which was, of course, the last great outbreak. Why the plague died away remains controversial, and there are competing theories, but the ways of handling it didn't much change. The Newcastle magistrates, so far as one can tell, followed those procedures. As to how far this was known, 1636 in the history of plague in Britain as a whole is not generally regarded as a particularly significant year. There was an outbreak in London that year, but it was relatively small scale. The really ghastly plagues in London were in the 17th century were 1604, 1625, and then 1665. 1636 was, there were about 10,000 dead in London, which is bad enough, but was relatively modest by the standards of metropolitan outbreaks. The Newcastle outbreak was the worst that year, and it seems to have come direct to Newcastle, probably from the Netherlands, and devastated the place in a way which no previous outbreak had, so far as can be told. The death rate was possibly, I say possibly, the highest as a percentage of the population of any English outbreak in this period. I mean, London, of course, had a population which was over 500,000 by the 1660s. So if 20% of the population is dying, as has been estimated for 1665, that's an awful lot of people. Newcastle's deaths were nothing like that. The recorded mortality is towards 6,000. But my estimate is that was 47% of the population of Newcastle. So as a percentage of the population, it was possibly the worst. It may have been exceeded by Colchester. In 1665, the Great Plague of London, as we think of it, also hit Colchester. And it's been suggested that maybe half the population of Colchester died. So Newcastle and Colchester seem to be near the top of the league. And I think one of the reasons that the Newcastle plague is so very well documented is because the outbreak engulfed the entire city. It hit the people of small property, the people who leave records. Most of the deaths in London were in the poorest East London parishes. I've checked out, for example, the testamentary and litigation evidence for London for 1636, and I've had a look at 1625 to a lesser extent. Nothing like the same amount of material. And I think the reason for that is it's primarily the poor who are dying. This outbreak, as I say, engulfed the city. It involved other areas. The 1604 outbreak in Newcastle was primarily confined to the Sandgate. But this time it was different. And I think, as historians we benefit from the fact that it was so awful. It generated the evidence.
There's a question here. All right, Sue first. Yeah.
In London, the physicians were fairly notorious for leaving sharpish when a plague started. How many physicians did Newcastle have at the time, and did they leave or did they stay?
I can't give you the figure off the top of my head. It's in the book somewhere, that the meetings of the barber surgeons guild. I think there were about a dozen of them. Their meetings continued briefly in the house of one of the members at the very early stages of the plague. Then, like most guilds, they suspended meetings. Some of them actually died, and their wills and inventories are there. So they must have continued to practice their vocation. How many may have left, one can't say, but some of them certainly stayed. Similarly, with the clergy, the two principal clergymen of the time appear to have left. Robert Jennison left. He wrote his tract from outside. Yaldard Alvey, his great rival, the Arminian vicar of St. Nicholas, vanishes from sight. Some of the curates stayed. 2 of them died, 2 survived, but they were there signing every page of the burial register. In St. John's and St. Nicholas. But people like Ralph Tailor, in a sense, were amongst the principal professional providers of services to the afflicted. They helped people settle their estates. They provided the documentation which their families would need in the aftermath. They were there, listening to people. In a sense, they're performing a kind of pastoral role almost.
Your question?
I can probably,
Oh, he's there you go.
okay, you're beginning to hint at an answer to the question I have. I mean, it has an elegant signature. And you say it came up time and time and time again in some the sense that he was specialising in this? I mean, he must have been one of few scriveners. I mean, did he? Do you think that he actually sort of, in a sense, got that?
Yeah, it's an interesting point. It's one I didn't actually include in the book, but it's crossed my mind. He was far more. I mean, there must be a lot was lost in both terms. In terms of litigation, about half the court book of 1637 is missing. It's a fragment. What survives? Many wills and inventories have probably been lost. Nonetheless, in what survives, his presence is quite extraordinary. He's only 25. He's starting. He may have been more willing than others to take the risk.
That's right. It must have been risky.
It's curious that after the plague, there was still after the main plague, there was still some. What could you call it? There were still a few scattered subsequent cases. He was involved in two of them. It's almost as if he was the go-to man. So yes, that has occurred to him. And I suspect that the fact he was willing to do this made him.
Well, he did get
Yeah,
married.
I mean, the way they used to say people had a good war. You know, he had a good place. It sounds dismal to say something like that, but there is a sense of that. It's mentioned in the book that in tracking him, there's actually a gap of almost 6 weeks where there's no record of what he's doing, and then he reappears, he's more active than ever. My guess is that he actually got the disease and recovered, and having done so may have had the confidence. I mean, there are so many conflicting opinions, but I mean, contemporaries believe that if you'd had the plague and recovered, you were immune, which again may be part of the picture. The fact that he didn't have any children, which is also mentioned in the book, it's crossed my mind again. There's some evidence that people who recovered from the plague could be sterilized. Anyway, it's pure speculation, but yes, it's possible.
We have time, I think, for one final question.
You mentioned briefly the plague pit.
Yeah.
Sandgate, was it, or that area? Do you know how many plague pits there would be within the city walls?
All that's known is on in the figures that are given by the various people who recorded, had access to the town's bills of mortality, because they were leading figures. Jennison, Colson, and there's one other I now know. They give figures for what's described as Garthside. And there's been debate in the past about what Garthside meant. It wasn't Gateshead. No, it definitely wasn't. Was it the Castle Garth? Was there a plague pit in the Castle Garth? I think not. But there's a place called Gartheads, or there was a place called Gartheads, close to where the Keelman's Hospital is now, to the north of Sandgate. And it was an open space at the time, used for recreation. And I speculated in the book that was where people were being buried in mass graves, because the mortality would have been at its very worst in Sandgate, and that would be an appropriate place. Well, interestingly, this third version of the bills of mortality, which is it's always existed, but I've just learned about it. Interestingly, it doesn't call it Garthside, it calls it Gartheads. So it kind of confirms that probably is where the pits were.
And each of the churches mentioned, would they have plague pits as well?
I think they just, they kept, it could be as bad as up to 17 or 18 burials a day. And how they were handling that in the churchyards is not clear. They must have been burying most people in the churchyards, and we don't know, but I could speculate that they were doing what some London churches did. For example, St. Bride's Fleet Street, they dug very deep graves, and then they added coffins to them and then filled them in when they were full. They may have been doing something like that. But it's again part of the scene one has to imagine that these churchyards are being opened day after day for as many as 18 burials per day. But only some seem to have been buried in mass graves.
Now, Dr. Peter Wright over there has agreed to say a word of thanks on behalf of the Society.
Professor Wrightson, it has been a privilege to listen to a most stimulating and illuminating lecture today. It's easy to see why you have been described as arguably the leading early modern British historian in the world. We're very fortunate that you have actually, being an economic and social historian, chosen to study this area. We know you come from not far away from here, but the fact you can look to this area with your encyclopedic knowledge, not just of the documents, but how to search them, you're able to do a huge amount of good in improving the knowledge that we have of this area. And I think anybody who worked in the historical field in this area would feel very grateful to you. This particular study you've done, Ralph Tailor, is really fascinating. And I think one of the things that it really shows you is what the benefits you get from the forensic analysis, the documentation that you actually found, is absolutely extraordinary. And it was really revealing and quite moving to hear the details of the individuals crying out of windows to scriveners to write their last wills and testaments as they were sadly affected by the disease. It's been an absolute privilege to hear you, and I think we ask the audience to show their appreciation for